It's been a very successful conference, and it's really my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this final plenary, who will bring together all the different elements that we have learned about economics and nutrition and health economics. Also, it's a pleasure for me because I have known each of these people for a number of years, and they participated in a number of IHEA events. John Cawley is a professor in the Department of HPAM, Health Policy Analysis and Management at Cornell. In addition to that, he's been a visiting professor at University of Sydney, the National University of Ireland. He's a research associate for the National Bureau of Economic Research, and also a fellow of IZA, the Institute for Labor Analysis. He's been the recipient of many awards, including the Investigator Award in Health Policy Research from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the John Thompson Prize for Young Investigators, which I think was a few years ago, right? Are you still a young investigator? Richard Dunn is assistant professor in department at the University of Connecticut, and he's also an affiliate for their Health Improvement and Policy. He was previously at Texas A&M University. And finally, Nate Teft, I have a particular fondness for because in addition to his many years of service as an assistant professor at Bates College in Maine, and his several years at my alma mater at the University of Washington in Seattle. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, he had the fortune or misfortune to be our lead assistant, graduate assistant, to running the very first American Society of Health Economists meetings. And so we consider him part of our staff, and I still want to order him about, but I guess now it's his chance to order us about. Gentlemen.
Thanks, Tom. So Richard Dunn, Nathan Teft, and I would just like to thank the organizers of the conference. It's been wonderful. Thank you very much. And also to thank you for your interest in this topic. So what we want to cover today is what do we know about the economics of obesity and where do we go from here? And what we want to do is provide you with two sort of products today. So the first is to give you an overview of the economics of obesity. And then second, to do a deep dive into two areas of particular interest. So to be more specific, what I'll do is I'll cover that broad overview of the economics of obesity, start by defining terms and motivating the topic by discussing the high prevalence and rapid increase in the trend of obesity worldwide, and then talk about what we know about the economics of obesity in terms of the economic causes of obesity, the economic consequences of obesity, and then economic approaches to treatment and prevention. At that point, Richard Dunn will do a deep dive into the role of the food environment in all of this, and then Nathan Teft will take over and talk about probably the most commonly advocated anti-obesity policy, which is a tax on energy-dense foods or sugar-sweetened beverages. So to start by just defining terms, obesity is most commonly defined using body mass index or BMI, and your BMI is calculated as your weight in kilograms divided by your height in meters squared. And depending on your age, your BMI is used to classify you as obese or non-obese according to the following thresholds. So if you're a youth, if you're age 19 or below, then you're considered obese if your BMI exceeds or meets the 95th percentile of the historic distribution. Among adults, you're classified as obese if your BMI is equal to or greater than 30. So BMI is a very limited measure of fatness because it doesn't actually measure fat, right? It's just weight over height. It ignores the difference between muscle and fat. And there's consequences of this. So some work that I've done with Richard Burkhauser shows that the use of BMI instead of more accurate measures of fatness leads to an exaggeration of racial disparities in obesity. So specifically, it makes African American women seem much more obese relative to white women than they truly are, according to more accurate measures of fatness. Other work that's been done finds that the use of BMI, that BMI is a less effective predictor of things like heart attacks, morbidity, mortality. And so there are consequences to using this very rough measure of fatness. And so what do I mean when I say that there are more accurate measures of fatness? Well, you could use percent body fat, you could use fat mass in kilograms, and these are measurable. So for example, what's shown here on the slide is a bod pod. It's one of the newer ways of measuring body composition, and it measures it through air displacement. Dual X-ray absorptiometry uses dual wavelengths of X-rays. Bioelectrical impedance analysis uses low levels of electricity. So we can measure fatness accurately. It's just that in most of the data sets that you and I have access to, those more accurate measures aren't contained in them, right? All we get is weight and height. And so that's why BMI is most commonly used. And in fact, it's what was used in most of the studies that we'll be discussing today. Now, a whole separate issue is that most of the time our data sets only have self-reports of weight and height. And that leads to a whole other set of issues related to measurement error. And so in some work that I've done with Catherine McLean, we found that this measurement error leads to bias that is not always necessarily attenuating. In other words, this self-report bias can actually lead to overestimates of, for example, the economic consequences of obesity. So that sort of concludes the part on defining our terms. And now we want to think about why is obesity a particularly interesting thing to be studying. So obviously an important part of that motivation is the fact that there's been a recent rise in the prevalence of obesity. So for example, this is showing you data from the United States. And it's data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Surveys, which are nationally representative data and consist of measurements of weight and height. And so the top line here is showing you the prevalence of obesity for women, and the bottom line is showing you the prevalence of obesity for men, and then the solid line in the middle is the average of the two genders. And the y-axis is the prevalence, the x-axis is years. And so what you can see is that the prevalence of obesity was growing very slowly from 1960 to 1970 to 1980, and then grew very rapidly from 1980 to 1990 to 2000. And it's continued to grow, just at a slower rate, since the year 2000. And the U.S. isn't alone in this. That trend you just saw for the U.S. has been mirrored in many other countries. This is data for select OECD countries. This shows you the trends for women from 1970 to the year 2000. This shows you the trends for men. And you can see that although the U.S. is the highest, the trends are quite substantial in places like Hungary, England, Australia, Canada, Spain, Italy, and so on. So in virtually every developed country of the world, we've seen rises in obesity, as well as in many developing countries as well. So the current prevalence of obesity, the World Health Organization estimates that over 500 million, that's billion with a B, adults worldwide are clinically obese, and that represents 12% of all adults in the world. The Institute of Medicine and the World Health Organization both describe the current rates of obesity as epidemic, and interestingly, the prevalence continues to differ considerably across countries. So it can be complicated to compare the prevalence of obesity across countries because most countries don't have nationally representative samples regularly collected that measure weight and height. But the World Health Organization has sort of done its best to make the data comparable, and they've classified countries according to their prevalence of obesity in this map. So red is the highest category. A country shown in red has a prevalence of obesity that's equal to or higher than 30%, and this is for adults, men and women combined. So you can see that the United States is in fact in that highest category, but so is Mexico, Venezuela, Libya, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Syria, South Africa. And some of the countries of the world actually with the highest prevalence of obesity aren't really even visible in that map, because the highest prevalences of obesity are found in smaller Polynesian countries. So for example, Nauru has the highest prevalence of obesity in the world. 2/3 of all Nauru male adults are obese. Roughly 3/4 of all female adults are obese. Cook Islands, Tonga, Samoa, and so on. So you may have heard that the United States is the most obese nation in the world, but you can see according to the World Health Organization, we're actually 14th. So there's some small reassurance in that, I suppose. So, when you look at these dramatic increases in the prevalence of obesity, these incredible disparities across country, even disparities within a given country, it really makes you ask, well, why do we see these disparities? Why do we see these trends? What causes some people to be obese and not others? And there has been an incredibly breathtakingly broad set of hypotheses introduced for why obesity has risen and why some people are obese and not others. So these are just some of the explanations that have been advanced that aren't just hypotheses, but have really been tested, and there's been some evidence found for them. So some researchers claim it's due to decreased sleep. Some people say it's greater exposure to chemicals that are disrupting our hormones. Some people argue that it's due to increased air conditioning, meaning that we sweat off fewer pounds. So that, all your walking to and from this conference venue has, burned some calories as you sweat to cool your body. Increased consumption of pharmaceuticals like antidepressants may have led to weight gain. Women giving birth at older ages, even changes in viruses, changes in gut microbes. These all have some evidence to support them. But what we're going to be focusing on today are really the economic economic explanations, right? That's our comparative advantage. And in particular, given the amount of time that we have, we need to be selective. What we'll do is we'll focus on the studies with the most credible identification strategies that really estimated causal effects in a credible way. So what are some of these possible economic causes of obesity? So one obvious possible contributor would be income. And in fact, if you look, it is in fact true that, for example, higher income women are less likely to be obese. But is that causal? So in one study that I did with Kosely, Simon, and John Moran, we took advantage of the natural experiment of the Social Security benefits notch. So this is a legislative accident in the United States that led certain birth year cohorts of retirees to receive higher retirement benefits than others. And so it's got nothing to do with their ability, with their work history. It's just some people got extra income than others in retirement. So when we use that variation in income, what we find is a really precisely estimated zero impact of that income on their weight. So it doesn't look like there's any detectable impact on retirees, at least, of income on their weight. Another researcher, Max Schmeisser, took advantage of the variation across states and over time in the generosity of a program called the Earned Income Tax Credit, which offers wage subsidies to low-income workers. And what he finds is no effective income on weight for men, but among women, an extra $1,000 a year raised their weight by an average of a pound. Another recent paper took advantage of a casino opening as a natural experiment. So in the United States, when a casino opens, the profits are frequently distributed to tribal members in ways that have nothing to do with their income, their work at the casino. It's just sort of a benefit of being in the tribe. And so they take advantage of that natural experiment of these payments starting up. And these researchers find that the extra income raises the weight of adolescents who live in low-income households, but had no impact on the weight of adolescents who live in higher-income households. So looking across these different studies, it looks like lower-income people may gain weight when their income rises, but people more at the middle of the income distribution, it may have no detectable impact. So another possible economic cause of obesity would be education. And it is in fact true that better educated individuals are less likely to be obese. But is that causal? So some researchers have taken advantage of the natural experiment of governments raising their minimum schooling requirements. So for example, Damon Clark and Heather Royer looked at England, and they exploited this significant increase in minimum schooling requirements there, and they found no detectable impact of this additional education on weight, on BMI, on overweight or obesity. But in some cases, their point estimates are substantial and just imprecise. Other researchers, Brunello et al., looked at 9 countries in Europe and used the same identification strategy, increases in minimum schooling, and they found no effect of education for men, but among women, they found that an additional year of education reduced the risk of obesity by 1.85 percentage points, or about 15%, so a pretty substantial increase. So one other possible economic contributor to obesity could be peer effects. And so there's a really interesting study, really interesting randomized experiment called Moving to Opportunity. So the US government was looking to incentivize lower income people to move out of low income bad neighborhoods. And so they offered poor households these vouchers that were basically rent subsidies that were only valid if they moved to a lower poverty neighborhood. And so what Jeff Kling and Jens Ludwig and others found is that 5 years after being incentivized to move to a better neighborhood, the treatment group was 4.8 percentage points less likely to be obese. And after a dozen years, the treatment group was between 3.4 and 4.6 percentage points less likely to be morbidly obese. So after a dozen years, there wasn't actually a detectable effect on obesity per se, but there was one on morbid obesity. They're not able to say exactly what the mechanism might be, right? Is there more sidewalks? Is it lower crime? Is it access to better supermarkets, or so on? Another interesting story in this vein is that by Olga Yakasheva and her colleagues, and they take advantage of the natural experiment of freshmen to college being randomly assigned roommates and test for peer effects. For boys, they find no peer effects in weight for boys, but for girls, they find that the girls who were assigned a heavier roommate freshman year tended to gain more weight during freshman year, and that the roommates who were most influential were those who were lighter or came from a higher income family. So evidence of peer effects there. Now another obvious sort of economic contributor to obesity might be the food environment, and that's exactly what Richard Dunn is going to go into detail on next. So now shifting gears, so that sort of summarizes what we know about some of the economic causes of obesity. And so now I want to move and talk about what we know about the economic consequences of obesity. And when you're thinking about what the economic consequences might be, you sort of want to start by thinking what the medical consequences are. So I used to think of as fat as just being dead weight, just extra stuff we carried around. But it turns out that collectively, fat cells represent an endocrine organ that secretes hormones, and those hormones damage our bodies. So for example, fat cells release resistin, which causes insulin resistance in diabetes. And diabetes in turn can cause blindness, circulation problems, kidney failure, all sorts of problems. That insulin resistance, the pancreas responds to that by releasing more and more insulin, to the point that the insulin levels in an obese individual's body can become carcinogenic. And so that's why obese individuals are at a higher risk of cancer, and not just cancers of the digestive tract or colon, but cancers of reproductive organs and other organs. And then finally, fat cells also release the hormone leptin, and leptin damages our cardiovascular system, contributes to heart attacks, heart disease, lung problems, and so on. So not surprisingly, obesity is associated with premature mortality. So it's estimated by the World Health Organization that overweight and obesity combined are responsible for 2.8 million preventable deaths per year. And it's estimated that for the US, for example, just for one example, obesity is responsible for 365,000 deaths per year, which is, someone at the CDC put it, that's like 3 fully loaded jumbo jets crashing every day. And think of what the outcry would be as if that many people were dying from that cause. But because the deaths from obesity are occurring behind closed doors, they're occurring from different immediate causes like heart attack or stroke, it's just less visible, it's less salient. So obviously, you would think, given these medical consequences of obesity, that there might be significant medical care costs associated with obesity. And in fact, if you look at the correlations, it is of course true that obese individuals have higher costs. But it's not clear at that point whether there's a causal effect. And so to try and answer that question, Chad Meyerhofer and I exploited the heritability of weight. So weight or obesity has a very high heritable component. It's estimated that the majority of variance in obesity and body weight may be heritable or genetic. And so we take advantage of that heritability of weight in data sets that include the weight of biological relatives that can serve as an instrument. And what we learned from those IV models, or what we estimate, is that obesity raises annual medical care costs by $3,508 per obese adult. And those higher costs are really across the board. It's higher inpatient hospital costs, it's higher outpatient doctor visits, it's higher prescription drug expenditures. And so in aggregate, the annual costs of obesity for the US add up to $315.8 billion, or more than $1 in $4 that we spend on healthcare, because it does affect heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, and so on. So this is a graph from our paper in pharmacoeconomics this year. And the dark line here, so this is showing, the y-axis is showing you predicted medical expenditures. The x-axis is your BMI. And then the solid line here is showing you the predicted medical expenditures at that level of BMI. On either side of that estimate are dashed lines that show you the 95% confidence interval. And then the distribution here of the dotted line is just showing you the distribution of BMI in that sample, which is the medical expenditure panel survey. So something that I think is interesting about this graph is that it's not the case that the relevant comparison is between the non-obese and the obese, right? So you don't see a giant step function up right at the medical threshold of obesity of BMI of 30. Right? The medical expenditures are actually very level along a very wide range of BMI. And you really only see a dramatic increase in costs in the range of morbid obesity, a BMI of 35, of 40. So this is interesting because it says what's really expensive is morbid obesity, not obesity per se. And it's informative about where you'd want to target interventions if your goal is to reduce medical care costs. So another economic consequence of obesity involves the labor market. So exploiting that same natural experiment of the heritability of weight, I've estimated what's the causal impact of obesity on wages. And what I find for the United States is that the impact of weight on wages varies considerably by gender and race ethnicity. So the greatest impact is for white females, among whom a 10-pound increase in weight is associated with a decrease in wages of 2.8%. And there's really no detectable impact for men of weight on wages in the US. Brunello and de Ombres have used the same identification strategy for 9 countries in Europe, including Italy, and they find that a 10% increase in BMI lowers the wages of females by 1.86% and males by 3.27%. And that's the average across all 9 countries. But the effective weight on wages was significant for both men and women in Italy in that study. So this leads to this interesting question, which is, why does obesity lower wages? So on the one hand, you might think, well, we know that obesity, causes diabetes, it causes these other health problems. Maybe it's worsening people's health, maybe they're missing more work, maybe they have lower productivity. And that may be true, but it really can't be the whole story, because non-parametric studies of weight and wages have found that women's wages start falling with BMI at very low levels of BMI, at levels of like 20 to 23. So that's at the low end of the range of healthy weight and almost underweight. So what Gregory and Room, for example, one of the papers in this vein conclude is that this is not the result of poor health, it's really the result of discrimination. It may be preferences of employers for women of a certain BMI or preferences of customers for women of a certain BMI in the employee role. So another possibility is that it's, like I said, discrimination. And the work of Dan Olof Ruth is very relevant here. So what he did is conducted an audit study in Sweden where he sent very similar resumes to job openings, and on those resumes attached photographs, which apparently is the practice in Sweden, and digitally, sort of with a computer, manipulated the photographs to make people either look heavier or lighter. And so the heavier of the pair with identical qualifications was 6 to 8 percentage points less likely to get an initial job interview than the lighter person with basically equivalent qualifications. So it does seem like discrimination is part of the answer for why we see this correlation between weight and wages. So now let me shift to the third and final topic I wanted to cover. So I've already talked about economic causes of obesity and then economic consequences of obesity. And now I'd like to talk about economic insights into treatment and prevention. But first, I think it's very relevant to ask, why is this any of our business, right? If people want to eat more than we like to eat, if people want to be less sedentary than we like to be, who are we to go and intervene and question their judgment? So it turns out there actually are economic rationales for government intervention in the realm of obesity. There are market failures. So the first very relevant market failure is negative externalities. So like I said, obesity raises medical care costs, and obese individuals are not paying those higher medical care costs out of their pocket. They're primarily being paid for by third-party payers, public health insurance or group health insurance on the private side. And neither your tax payments that fund public health insurance nor your individual premiums that pay for group private health insurance are indexed to your weight. And so as a result, lower weight, healthier people are subsidizing the medical costs of less healthy, obese individuals. And that's a relevant market failure. Two other relevant market failures are that there may be imperfect information, like at the point of purchase, point of consumption of food. You may not know how many calories or how much fat is in a given product. And then second, we may think that consumers aren't acting fully rationally. And that's kind of a slippery slope argument to make. We probably don't want to start assuming willy-nilly that lots of adults can't make up their can't make informed decisions about food. But I think when it comes to children, we can agree that children are probably not capable of fully taking into account the consequences of their actions, especially when it comes to energy-dense foods, sugary foods. So let me take each of those in turn. So the first market failure is negative externalities. So what's an appropriate response to that? So if you think of it in a Pigouvian sense, if it's fat cells creating these bad hormones that harm our bodies that raise medical care costs, then what we want to tax is the fat itself. You would want to literally have a Pigouvian tax on body fat. I'm actually going to set that aside as sort of politically unattractive. Nobody has sort of seriously advocated not just weighing people, but checking their body composition, then handing them the bill. But some countries actually have come close. So for example, Singapore had what's called the Trim and Fit program, where they would weigh all the school children, and then the schools that had higher prevalences of overweight among the kids, those schools were punished. So the kids weren't being punished directly, but the schools were as an intermediary. And then in Japan, they have the Metabo law, where older adults have their waist circumference measured, the waist circumference because they think that's a better predictor of heart attack than BMI. And if there's a high prevalence of excess waist circumference, then either the employer is fined or the local government is punished by the federal government in Japan. So some people have come towards this kind of Pigouvian tax on body fat directly. But most people don't seriously consider that an option. Another approach, though, would be to tax foods that you think contribute to obesity. And that's exactly why Nathan Teft is going to do a deep dive into a discussion of taxes on energy-dense foods at the close of this plenary. So other options, though, to internalize these externalities, one is to offer morbidly obese individuals financial rewards for weight loss. And I think these are really interesting. I think it's very appealing as an economist to think of offering incentives to people who are morbidly obese in the sense of, it has the potential to be win-win, where medical costs fall, people get paid to do what they may want to do anyway. But it has a really mixed record of effectiveness. So some studies, like some of those by Kevin Volpe, find substantial weight loss from offering people financial rewards to lose weight. Others, like work that I've done with Josh Price, some of Kevin Volp's other work, Eric Finkelstein, these studies find very high attrition, lots of dropping out, and very modest weight loss from financial rewards. So as an economist, I think it's a really exciting, appealing idea, but I think we just haven't worked out the kinks yet of the optimal design of these rewards to minimize attrition and maximize effectiveness. Another possibility is to subsidize physical activity, and we already do this with public school sports teams and gymnasiums and physical education in schools. Even offering public parks is in effect subsidizing physical activity for citizens. But in work that I've done with David Frisvold and Chad Meyerhofer, we've tried to identify the causal effect of physical education in schools on children's weight. And we do that by exploiting variation across states and over time in minimum PE requirements in the US. And what we find is very little evidence that school physical education programs actually prevent obesity. You can make kids more active at school, but they tend to offset that with less activity outside of school with very little net effect on their weight. But even if these other, sort of active endeavors turn out to be, politically infeasible, it seems like at a minimum, the government can stop subsidizing bad diets. It seems like in all developed countries, we could try and reform agriculture policy, which in some cases lowers the prices of energy-dense foods. So in the US, exceptions to that are milk and sugar. Milk and sugar are actually kept more expensive than they would be in a free market. But there's other energy-dense foods like cheese and certain meats that are actually made cheaper. Another thing that we can do is make sure that food assistance programs for needy individuals don't include energy-dense foods or don't subsidize energy-dense foods. So, for example, the U.S. Food Stamp Program, or SNAP, allows low-income individuals to buy anything they want in the supermarket that's not ready to eat. So you can buy, or that's not hot prepared food, I should say. So you can buy cookies, you can buy chips, and it's an open question as to whether that's really ideal when there's scarce resources and an obesity problem. So the second market failure I mentioned is the problem of imperfect information, that oftentimes we just don't know what's the calorie and fat content of these foods we're considering eating. So many developed countries have nutrition label laws, and they have them for packaged foods, and increasingly they're having them for restaurant menu labels. So for example, and these do seem to have some effects. So for example, the Nutrition Facts Panel in the US on packaged foods did lead to declines in the sales of high-fat products. So Alan Matthews, one of my colleagues, looked at the salad dressing market, and he found that the Nutrition Facts Panel led consumers to shift away from high-fat salad dressings to lower-fat salad dressings as a result of that information. Now, we don't know yet much about nationwide menu label laws. The U.S. has passed one, but its enactment has actually been pushed back. But we do have isolated menu label laws in certain jurisdictions. So New York City, for example, implemented one several years ago, and multiple researchers have evaluated it. So Bollinger et al., for example, they got a hold of the Starbucks data set, and therefore they have millions of observations. And what they do is they do a difference in difference before and after the menu label law in New York City for New York City and some control cities, Boston and Philadelphia. And what they find is that the number of calories purchased at Starbucks fell 5.8% as a result of the menu label law. And it interestingly was all concentrated in the food options at Starbucks. People didn't decrease their drink calories at all. Brian Elbel took another approach and got a hold of people's receipts as they were exiting fast food restaurants. And he also used a difference in difference approach, New York City versus Newark, New Jersey. And what he finds is no change from the New York City menu label law in terms of the calories that people purchased. Now, both of these studies can only look at purchases, not consumption, and that's a general limitation in this area. But I should point out that even if consumers don't change their behavior as a result of menu label laws, there can still be benefits because often restaurants and food manufacturers do. So there's been numerous studies that document that after information dissemination occurs, whether it's on prepackaged foods or in restaurant menu labels, that the food manufacturers and restaurants reformulate their products to decrease calories and decrease fat. So that's another way these laws can be beneficial, even if consumers aren't particularly responsive to the information. And so then finally, the last economic rationale for government intervention to do something about obesity is if we don't think people are acting rationally. And like I said, we might want to be really cautious about applying this to adults. I know I don't want people scrutinizing my decisions about food and deciding whether I'm not rational or not. But there is general agreement that we want to protect children. And so as a result, we have bans and limitations on advertising of food to children in places like Quebec, Norway, Sweden, and South Korea. In the U.S., we're probably not going to see that kind of a law because there's an obstacle in the form of the precedent of commercial speech. So in the U.S., there is a legal recognition that companies have a right to free speech, and so there's kind of a high bar for Congress to limit what companies can say. But at a very much at the minimum, though, we could, for example, end agriculture programs that help to promote and market energy-dense commodities. Another suggestion that's been proposed is to take away the tax deductibility of any kind of advertising of food to children. So just to sum up sort of what I think is true about the economic literature on obesity, in terms of causes, what are the economic causes of obesity? I don't think there's any one single dominant economic cause of obesity. Many factors like income, peer effects, prices, each seem to have modest effects. In terms of consequences, the economic consequences are relatively clear: higher medical care costs of morbid obesity and lower wages for women. And then in terms of prevention and treatment, just like there was no single one cause of obesity, it looks like there's no single dominant solution. There's no magic bullet that's going to reduce or reverse those trends I showed earlier. Instead, a combination of policies like taxes on energy-dense foods, financial incentives for weight loss, menu labels, each of them might have modest effects, but maybe together can have a more meaningful impact. So obviously, this has been a selective review. If you'd like more information, I have a review of this topic coming out in the Journal of Health Economics in just about a month or so. So thank you, and I'm now going to turn it over to Richard Dunn, who's going to talk about the role of the food environment.
Okay, thank you, John. In my time, I'm going to speak about a particular aspect of the research that's being done in the economics of obesity, research on the food environment and its impact on both eating decisions and obesity outcomes. I'm going to follow a structure very similar to John. First, define what I mean by the food environment, then discuss what we know as economists, why we care about the question in the first place. And this is an area of research that I've been working on for the last decade. And so looking forward, for other individuals who are interested in this area over the next decade, what are going to be the important research questions that we as economists can make a contribution to? So when starting to think about the food environment, you can get into some trouble by defining the food environment in such a way that captures pretty much the entire economics of obesity literature. And so for the purposes, given the amount of time I have to actually speak to you all, I'm going to focus on a much smaller section of the literature that focused on availability. Now, availability is generally a term that you find in, say, the public health or epidemiology literature, but to translate that into economies, we're going to treat the availability of unhealthy or healthy food sources as the time cost or effort or monetary resources needed to be able to procure that particular basket of goods. And when we think about healthy food sources, maybe we're thinking about supermarkets or fruit and vegetable markets that sell particularly healthy food items, and unhealthy food sources, things like convenience stores or fast food restaurants. Now, what do we as economists know? Well, this economist knows that there are lots of articles finding lots of correlations. The problem with a lot of the work in epidemiology and public health and even health economics is that correlation obviously is not causality, and availability can't be treated sort of as a partial equilibrium outcome. Availability is the outcome of individuals making a decision about where they live, where they work, where they go over the course of the day, and also entrepreneurs deciding, where am I going to make the most money? And so this endogeneity creates the identification problem that we as economists all love. It's why we get paid. But when it comes to articles that set out from the beginning to accept, we have endogeneity here, and this is my idea for how to overcome this selection problem with a clear, straightforward identification strategy, that is where we're really lacking. So let's look at one area of this research, the research on the availability of fast food in eating behavior and health outcomes. There's a handful of papers that tackle the endogeneity of the availability of fast food restaurants head on. I have two papers. There's a paper by Michael Anderson and David Matza and Pedro Alviola and his co-authors, and they all follow the same general premise. The idea is, at least in the United States, the transportation network, the road network at least, predates a lot of the suburbanization that has happened in the United States. And so we can treat the road network as exogenous, and then use the fact that fast food restaurants are going to want to open near where there are large interstates and highways because they're going to get an increase in the number of customers that they serve from individuals who travel on those roads but don't live nearby. And this process leads to an exogenous source of variation in the fast food that's available to the residents who live near the road. Okay. You do this. You run your IV estimate using distance to an interstate or the presence of interstate exits. And what do you find? And in general, all of these papers follow a similar pattern. If you pool all your data, there's almost no relationship between the availability of fast food and weight outcomes. When you go ahead and you break down the analysis, say by ethnicity or racial groups, that's where some interesting results tend to pop up. And so these are results from the paper in Dunn, Sharkey, and Harrell. The map is showing you in this 7-county area of central Texas that we studied where interstate and major highways are, the orange and black lines, and then the orange circles where restaurants are located, that there's no effect of availability on fast food on the probability of being obese for white individuals, but for African Americans in our sample, there is a large, statistically significant and economically significant impact on the availability of fast food and obesity outcomes. And so the takeaway from this is that there might be differences, heterogeneity in the response that's important to look at, and I will get back to this point in a little bit. Now, sometimes someone makes a policy decision that you as a researcher benefit from. And so Roland Sturm at Rand Corporation and his co-authors have looked at the recent decision by the City Council in Los Angeles to zone out new fast food restaurants opening in South LA, a relatively high poverty region of Los Angeles. The City Council said, no, we will no longer accept new fast food restaurants opening in this particular area. And Roland Sturm has looked at the data and shown, at least in the year since this policy has been in effect in his data, there was no impact on obesity in general. So that's kind of what we know in terms of exogenous variation in the availability of an unhealthy food source, fast food restaurants. Another paper worth mentioning is a paper by Chuck Cartmanche and Art Carden, which is in the Journal of Urban Economics, that looks at trying to find exogenous variation in the presence of Walmarts. Walmarts are exceptionally complicated beasts, really. They sell toasters, they sell television sets, they sell t-shirts. They are also the largest grocery retailer in the United States, both in terms of prepackaged goods, chips, cookies, sodas, but Walmart supercenters also have produce sections and sell dairy. Now, what Chuck and Art use as a source of identification is the fact that Walmart had a very specific strategy for expanding their base in the United States, and that was, we're going to open our stores first close to our headquarters and then expand out from there. So they used the distance between where the store is located and Bentonville, Arkansas, the headquarters city of Walmart Corp, to decide to generate exogenous variation. Now, accepting the fact that Walmart is the largest supermarket retailer in the United States, besides these papers here, we know really nothing else about what the effect of unhealthy or healthy food stores are on obesity outcomes. What's the effect of supermarkets? What's the effect of convenience stores? What's the effect of grocery stores, corner markets on obesity? And this is a real challenge, and so I would say the first important research area moving forward is identifying new approaches to estimate the causal effect of the food environment, not just on the types of businesses that haven't been looked at before, but these are all IVs, and so they're local average treatment effects. And so you can look at the same fast food restaurant and have a different instrument for it and saying that instrument, that source of variation is affecting a different set of people and get a different answer. And so we need more instruments, we need more sources of exogenous variation to really nail this down. Finally, what you will notice on this slide is all 6 of the papers here are listed are based in the United States. And a lot of the research is just simply US-centric. I don't want to complain that it's US-centric. I'm one of the reasons why that's the case. But what we need are researchers both in middle-income countries, developing countries, and other developed countries to find sources of exogenous variation in the samples that they are most interested at to get a broader picture of what's going on. Why are we as economists investing this effort in trying to study this particular area, this connection between the food environment, eating behavior, and food outcomes? And I think the answer is because there are potential policy levers. We have control over zoning. And so to the extent that availability is attached to affordability, if you make something more available, you decrease the cost of procurement, and so you will potentially increase consumption of that good. And of course the opposite in terms of reducing availability of, say, unhealthy types of food. And so by using zoning, by saying things can open here but not there, or these things can't open at all, or we're going to subsidize certain businesses to open up in a particular place, perhaps we will change individuals' behavior and thus have better health outcomes. And so we care about it in terms of policy. Now, we can believe or not whether any of this will work, but if people are considering these policies, then economists need to step in using good methodological approaches to evaluate whether those policies will be effective or not. Now, I'm going to make a claim based upon my reading of the literature that the average effect of a large change in the food environment is just very likely to be small, if it exists at all. Rather, a more promising place for us to look is to think systematically what would need to be true for an economically meaningful relationship to arise in the first place. What groups do have sufficiently high values of time that a change in availability is going to lead to a big change in behavior? And so I think systematically identifying these subpopulations and then studying them is a place that the research agenda needs to go, as opposed to, say, a more ad hoc approach. We looked at this group just because we had the data, so why not? But to do that ex ante rather than explain why you looked at the population ex post. One group that I think that this is particularly important for is a group that has gotten the term time poor. It's a term originally coined back in the 1970s and still hangs around. Now, when we're thinking about the time poor, that may sound a little strange, right? We all have 24 hours in the day. We have the same endowment, so how can anyone be more time poor than the other person? It's not differences in the endowment of time, but rather the fungibility of that time. Can individuals shift activities across different members of the household? Can they move those activities to different times or different days? Or can they shift that work that they would do themselves that's time-intensive, home production, into purchasing market services instead? So I think that's a group of individuals where we might particularly find a big bang for our buck in changing the food environment. And so research moving forward that looked at time use, household resources, the food environment, and eating behavior, I think is a place that we need to go. We have time use surveys in the United States, ADIS. They exist in Europe with HADIS. I think as the cost of tracking the movements of individuals become cheaper using apps, giving them Fitbits, it would be really nice if we got a fuller picture of where people were going and linked it to time use. Now, I think looking at the time poor is important for another reason, and that is because time poverty is going to be highly concentrated in those of low socioeconomic status. And that is also the population where obesity is most concentrated. And so that's where the burdens, the costs of obesity are so highly concentrated. John has talked about some efficiency arguments for why we as economists should be studying this phenomenon, but I don't think efficiency is the only argument that economists need to look at when determining what are valuable places to be doing research. I think the distributional consequences of obesity are particularly strong, and we as economists should be caring not only about documenting what the distribution of the consequences of obesity are, but perhaps looking to see whether those most affected by obesity, whether policies will be particularly effective for them. And I think that plays into the health disparities literature, which gets much more attention in public health than it does, say, in health economics. Okay, so returning to the results that I presented previously, is it potentially a socioeconomic story that we're looking at here when we're looking at these differences between whites and blacks in this area of Texas? And the answer is no. So these results obviously throw income on the right-hand side, but if we stepped back and we did this, we said, okay, let's take a sample of whites and pull out a subsample and say, let's make them have the same income mean and standard deviation as the population for blacks. Is this just a socioeconomic story? And the answer is no. The results for low socioeconomic status whites look pretty much the same as African Americans. And so what is driving this difference? This is pure conjecture, but if you were to ask me, it's that the lives that whites live looks very different from the lives that African Americans live in the United States. There's extreme segregation in housing in the United States. There's segregation in employment. There's segregation in worship. There's segregation in the entire span of the activities of daily living. And so the extent that we only used one measure of availability here, fast food restaurants near your home, it's possible that for white residents, that just doesn't capture a lot of the place where the activities of daily living occur. Whereas for African Americans, maybe it is a much better measure given the concentration of activity in this particular area of Central Texas. And so I think a fourth research area is identifying better measures of exposure to take account of the full sphere of the geography in which we operate over the course of the day. I think folks in public health have put a good step forward on this. This is a paper by Thomas Burgoyne and Pablo Monsive, where they look at both where individuals live, where they work, the availability of public transportation. They use GPS software to calculate the shortest distance between home and work, and they have a map of the food outlets that are available in this space. This gives a much fuller picture of the food environment than I would have just looking at availability near home. Similar work has been done looking at children. I have some co-authors in Arkansas, and we're linking, we have similar data on where children live, where they go to school, looking at the commuting route that they would take between home and school, and linking that to BMI data that's available because children in public school in Arkansas are tested for BMI, and attempting to use this rich data source, in fact, as a way to find an exogenous source of variation in fast food exposure. And so I think it's not only a measurement error thing, I think it will increase the number of avenues that we have to find exogenous sources of variation to get some identification. I don't think these are the only methodological issues. I don't know whether methodological issues are as sexy in economics, but they are certainly important. The last one on this list, say, when we study what are the food consumption behaviors of individuals, we often rely on food frequency questionnaires. How often did you eat this? How much of that did you eat in the last week? There are systematic biases in these surveys. These surveys rarely pass validation studies very well. Worse, the tendency to overreport consumption of good food, in quotes, and underreport bad food tends to vary by the perceived value of these foods, which differ across individuals and vary systematically with characteristics of the individuals, and those characteristics tend to be connected to BMI. And so this is not white noise. This is not something that you can sort of flop off as this is classical measurement error and we don't need to worry about it and move on. I think as economists, we tend to do that much too quickly. I think, again, folks in epidemiology and public health have been much better about looking at getting high quality data that doesn't suffer from some of the measurement error issues that we tend to deal with in the data that we use but largely ignore. And so I think a really important research area for economists moving forward is to work interdisciplinarily with folks in epidemiology and public health, not only to use the higher quality data sets that they've put together, but also to work with them to try and find corrections because they have higher quality data sets that we can then import to the data sets that we use more commonly that sort of remove some of this measurement error issue. I think that is an important area. Finally, I've been talking about the food environment at a somewhat macro scale. I think there's a great literature being developed by John's colleagues at Cornell, Brian Wansik and Richard Just, that looks at the food environment on a very macro scale. Macro in terms of what does your kitchen look like? How do we redesign a kitchen or redesign a school cafeteria so that individuals make better choices in those micro environments in which they live? Now, I think we're limited here in terms of policy prescriptions. We're not going to pass laws that say this is how your kitchen should be laid out, but perhaps there is some movement here on saying this is how a school cafeteria should be laid out. If you're going to offer sugary beverages, those should be placed behind milk and water, and that will encourage children to make better eating choices. Now again, I'm a little skeptical about some of the applicability of this to policy areas. This is largely choices that individuals have to make for themselves, but nevertheless, I think this is a research area that is really going to take off in the food environment literature. I think it is going to be very culture dependent, and so if you do not yet have a food behavior lab in the country where you are from, the first mover advantage, I'd say, is going to be pretty strong moving forward. So to summarize, I think that zoning policy that changed the food environment is an important potential policy lever that could influence eating behavior and obesity outcomes. I'm not particularly optimistic that we'd find large average effects in the population, but identifying marginal populations that are particularly vulnerable, those are the individuals who may be in the margin, and those are the individuals we may be wanting to look at. I think the distributional consequences to policy are a perfectly reasonable motivation for conducting economic research. It doesn't just have to be about efficiency. We could care about distribution. Finally, a lot of the hurdles that we have facing us, finding exogenous sources of variation, getting better measures of exposure, and dealing with some of the measurement error issues that we already have in our existing data are going to be important challenges, and these are challenges that are likely going to require interdisciplinary cooperation. And so over the next decade, I expect that this is where we will be heading, or at least hope we will be heading. So with that, I'm going to finish and then pass it on to Nate Teff to discuss a particular policy intervention that he has worked on.
All right. Thank you, Tom and John and Richard. My portion of the talk is going to be about food and beverage price policies. And specifically, I'm going to offer you a case study, which is sugar-sweetened beverage taxes. I'll refer to them as SSBs. And I'm aware that I am the last speaker of the last session, so I'm going to be intentionally brief. So how has economics contributed to knowledge about SSB's taxes? That's the first question I'm going to ask and answer. And I'm also interested sort of more generally about how did our knowledge evolve. It's an interesting case study because it's a fairly recent policy development, and there's been quite a lot of action in the economics literature to consider here. So next I'll talk about what is coming. And what I mean by what is coming is what is coming in policy, first of all. There's been several new taxes and new developments in policy that will be interesting to study. And we can sort of apply the same research methods and new methods going forward, and I'll give you commentary as I go along on that. And lastly, I'll offer my summary thoughts, just some perhaps provocative thoughts as well. Okay, so first of all, why an SSB tax? Why did that become a hot policy in this area? Well, first of all, SSBs offer relatively little non-caloric nutrition, as you might suspect. And they represent a non-trivial portion of per capita calorie intake, both in Mexico and the United States. I do know in the United States that has been as much as 7% on average, but I think maybe a bit less than that more recently. In 2009, which is sort of the beginning of this case study, Brownell and co-authors proposed a penny per ounce excise tax on SSBs and published that paper in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is a very prominent journal, and this really sort of catapulted this idea onto the policy stage. It had been talked about quite a bit before that by public health researchers, but this, I would say, was a real, bringing it to prime time. And their argument was that it would combat obesity through reduced consumption of SSBs and also through increased revenue, which could be devoted to educational programs. So what's the evolution of contributions from economics? What do we bring to the table? Well, first of all, we've modeled behavior that contributes to body weight production and applied that to SSB taxes. And when I say we, I mean more generally. I'll talk about some of my work as well. But this is the sort of overview. Food demand systems have been applied to SSBs, and simulations based on those have been used to think about what would happen with taxes, and I'll talk about some of those. And finally, the work that I've specifically done, it falls under the category of quasi-experimental studies of real-world policies, in this case SSB taxes. And it's also perhaps interesting to think about how the evolution of knowledge might follow a similar pattern for other policies in the future. So what are these theoretical models of behavior I'm talking about? Well, first of all, Schrader and co-authors in a Journal of Health Economics paper early on talked about SSBs in the context of substitutes and complements. And so they essentially just developed a utility maximization model, noting that there'd be ambiguous effects depending on that structure, so we don't really know what's going to happen. Yanev et al. In Journal of Public Economics paper also discussed SSB taxes as an example in thinking about time use, and it's important since presumably healthier food at home and physical activity are competing for time. So we have to think about the implications of that as well. Moving from those static models, you could say, thinking about dynamic models, economists have also helped to enhance the knowledge in this context. So I sort of think of this as moving beyond linear regression models and extrapolating based on coefficients from those models and applying more general dynamic models. So for example, estimating weight production at 3,500 calories per pound, which is the energy content on average of a pound, overestimates food price change effects. And Cutler and co-authors noted this a while ago. Lin and co-authors more recently actually implemented a biological model and estimated it in this context, which did show in their model a lower than expected decrease in obesity as a result of SSB taxes. Goldman and all also point out that, hey, we should look at long-term behavioral effects as well, and should look at and sort of consider not just the biology. And they actually, in their research, find that long-term effects may be slightly larger than short-term effects. So they, in some sense, find the opposite effect. So it'd be interesting to see more research in this area, and I think there's a lot of work to do. With modeled price responses, this is sort of the next phase, the second phase of SSB tax research. These are essentially demand system models, and for example, Dharmasena and Capps in Health Economics published a paper in which they estimated the Quaid's model accounting for cross-product beverage substitution. So substitution not only from, between caloric and non-caloric beverages and also other related beverages. And when they account for the substitution, they note, again, a smaller reduction in consumption than might otherwise be expected. And coming out of that research, a few recent papers, one by Harding and Levenheim in 2014, which is an NBER working paper, suggests that it may be more efficient to adjust prices more broadly through taxation of nutrients. They actually simulate a model testing an SSB tax against a tax that includes all caloric sweeteners, and note that there's less deadweight loss for the latter. Mao and co-authors in 2012, this is actually published in Contemporary Economic Policy. They study a similar and come to similar conclusions using input prices, so inputs into the production of SSBs. Or alternatively, it may be more efficient to adjust prices by taxing calories. So in the American Journal of Agricultural Economics, Okrent and Alston estimate a demand model similarly. They also incorporate medical costs into their model and note that perhaps on net there's a welfare gain if medical care costs are appropriately accounted for. I think there's, again, a lot of area for future research in this area. For example, I know some of John's work that he discussed, estimating the causal effect of obesity on medical care, could be brought back and tied back into this literature, perhaps, all the way back to SSB taxes. Finally, the last category of research that I want to discuss are tax quasi-experiments. So this is looking at actual historical tax changes, and I've done some work in this area. And so generally we find that there are small obesity impacts at best from existing taxes. In our first paper, my first paper with Jason Fletcher and David Frisvold, published in Contemporary Economic Policy, we looked at adults using BRFIS, the BRFIS data set in the US, and state and time variation in US soft drink taxes. And when I say US soft drink taxes, I mean a combination of excise taxes and sales taxes where SSB, or soft drinks in this case, were basically taxed as an exception to food exemptions. So it's sort of, there's a differential tax with other food. And many of these taxes were motivated not for health reasons, but for revenue reasons. So it's a slightly different context for that reason. And in that paper, we found there's small obesity impact, minimal obesity impacts. In a separate paper published in the Journal of Public Economics, we studied both weight outcomes and consumption. And we found a reduction in self-reported soft drink consumption, in addition to a similar weight, small weight outcome or lack of effect on weight. And an increase in consumption of other caloric beverages. So we find a similar substitution from pattern going on as were found in the simulation studies. But this kind of begs the question, would larger, more salient taxes work? So like I said before, these historical tax rates in the United States are pretty modest. And also substitution is blunting their effects. So it may be a more targeted and larger tax would be more effective. We discuss this possibility in a JPAM point counterpoint with Frank Chaluka, Lisa Powell, and Jamie Triqui. So then one follow-up study that we did was to look at our historical tax rates and find the largest and most salient. These were in Ohio and Arkansas in the early 90s. This is approximately 10% equivalent. And we also looked at nonlinear models of existing taxes. We still found no substantial evidence of obesity effects in using these models. But again, these sort of digging through the data and trying to find the largest taxes before, even though they weren't that large, doesn't substitute for the real thing, which is what we're seeing now. So it's exciting to see, from a research perspective, that there are new taxes being implemented. So first of all, in Mexico, there's a 7 cents per liter tax on SSBs that was implemented at the beginning of 2014. And preliminary analysis by Mexico's National Institute of Public Health shows a 10% decrease in tax purchases during the first quarter of 2014 relative to the first quarter of the previous year. In Berkeley, California, just this year, a penny per ounce tax on SSBs was implemented in 2015 at the beginning of this year in the first quarter. And this is the first such tax in the United States. So both of these are really interesting possibilities for research. I know there are at least a couple papers presented at this conference on price pass-through as a result of these taxes. And so we're starting to get some information on price pass-through, and then hopefully we'll be able to examine consumption and eventually obesity effects as well. So again, these are both exciting opportunities to directly study large and visible SSB taxes. So I'll just leave with a couple of just perhaps provocative thoughts that are some of the ways that I think about this literature. So first of all, I generally, from my overall view of the literature, I usually think big and broad. So I tend to think that tax calories or taxing added caloric sweeteners more generally could be more effective. And even pushing that farther, subsidizing healthy foods in combination with taxing unhealthy foods or SSBs or calories or added caloric sweeteners could be even more effective. A couple of very recent papers studying incentive programs for subsidizing healthy foods, and I think one of them was a cash rebate program, the other was an actual subsidy, and they certainly showed that they were effective in increasing the purchases of healthy foods. And I think about that in contrast to more targeted taxes because based on the literature, I worry that they could backfire and not have as strong effects as hoped. The second major point I want to make is I think about the distribution of the welfare effects a lot. So SSB taxes are likely regressive, and this is because lower income households may pay a larger proportion of their budget when purchasing SSBs, and so that tax would hit them more. But the long-term health effects may be more progressive, as has been argued, and has been demonstrated in a couple of cases, although, as I said before, I think we could learn more about that. I also wonder, in thinking about the distributional effects, whether a broader tax could politically build more support through promotion as a shared burden. So that concludes our discussion of the causes, consequences, and policies related to obesity. So thank you.
I would like to give another round. I see this, and Richard, efficiency may not be the only thing, but this was an incredibly efficient presentation of a tasting menu to the current research on obesity and food consumption, to which I think we all appreciate.